All right, so we're up to chapter 4 in Thomas Pynchon's first novel, V, in which Esther gets a nose job. Now, we've already met Esther in the first chapter, and we saw Rachel Alglass in the second chapter going to Dr. Schoenmaker's office, who is the plastic surgeon, to pay her bill for her so she can get the job done. And apparently, and we saw Stencil, Herbert Stencil, had been invited by Esther to the party that the whole sick crew were having in chapter 2. And now we learned that Stencil was the one who introduced Esther to Schoenmaker because he knew how she felt about her nose. But it hasn't stopped her from being promiscuous. And so she and Stencil have a brief sort of father-daughter age gap affair. And then he introduces her to Schoenmaker, and so she goes to him to get a nose job. And so as the chapter opens up, she's riding on a bus to go visit him in the present timeline where they're having sex. And then she's riding on the bus, and then she goes to meet him. And then we get a flashback that is Roman numeral 1, and this is divided into 3 sections of Roman numerals 1, 2, and 3. One gives kind of a backstory, a little mini biography of Schoenmaker and where he came from. He was in World War I, and he admired the pilots, and he wanted to be one of the pilots, but he was only made a grease monkey instead. So he spent years working as a mechanic during the war, and there was one pilot in particular that he really looked up to and admired, a guy named Evan Godolphin, whose son Hugh Godolphin, I believe, we'll meet later in the novel. And Evan Godolphin is just a guy that Schoenmaker wanted to be, but could not. And so one day, Godolphin's plane crashes. So it crashes as it's landing on the runway, and then Schoenmaker happens to be there, and he goes and finds him, and his face is just a mess. It's total wreckage. And then so there's a plastic surgeon, a guy named Haladam, who is going to work on the face, and Schoenmaker has offered to donate some cartilage, but Haladam turns it down because instead the type of reconstruction of Godolphin's face that he wants to do involves the insertion of bits of the inanimate into his face, and this horrifies Schoenmaker, which is a bit of a surprise given the nose job description that Pynchon here gives and that I want to read some from. And it says that, so when he goes back to visit Godolphin and he's healing, it says that Godolphin received a nose bridge of ivory, a cheekbone of silver, and a paraffin and celluloid chin, which completely horrifies and outrages Schoenmaker, this invasion of these bits and pieces of the inanimate. So this is what inspires him to become a plastic surgeon. And he wants to be the type of plastic surgeon that does not invade his patients with the inanimate, but uses human skin and cartilage. So in a certain sense, he is the sort of Pynchon's first mad scientist, but in another sense, he's an undecidable because he's not one that is interested in invading someone's body with the inanimate. And so Godolphin's fate with the silver cheekbone and the ivory nose bridge and the celluloid chin already foreshadows the fate of V and her descent into the inanimate. And so that's the backstory on Dr. Schoenmaker. He's not entirely unsympathetic. But then in the comic scene here, which we have to read a bit from, that is Roman numeral 2, we see Esther go into his office, and she's sitting there. I'll read this paragraph. She's sitting there in his office. This is the office where we saw the clock with the 2 little imps on it, and the mirror behind it, that Rachel had gone to pay her bill for first. So now that bill is paid, so she's going in to get the nose job. And this is a flashback too. This novel it does not have a linear timeline. It's composed of flashbacks and flash forwards and present timelines, and so you always have to be careful where you're at on Pynchon's various timelines. He's got them sort of braided and interwoven here. So now listen to his description of the patients that are in the waiting room, and I think Pynchon describes them here with great humor, because Esther is just there to get a nose job. There's nothing else wrong with her face. She's not in the same category as these people. Collected for her in the anteroom that day were a rogues gallery of malformed. A bald woman without ears contemplated the gold imp clock, skin flush and shiny from temples to occiput. Beside her sat a younger girl whose skull was fissured, such that 3 separate peaks, paraboloid in shape, protruded above the hair, which continued down either side of a densely acneed face like a skipper's beard. Across the room, studying a copy of the Reader's Digest, sat an aged gentleman in a moss-green gabardine suit who possessed 3 nostrils, no upper lip, and an assortment of different-sized teeth which leaned and crowded together like the headstones of a boneyard in tornado country. And off in the corner, looking at nothing, was a sexless being with hereditary syphilis whose bones had acquired lesions and had partially collapsed, so that the gray face's profile was nearly a straight line, the nose hanging down like a loose flap of skin nearly covering the mouth, the chin depressed at the side by a large sunken crater containing radial skin wrinkles, the eyes squeezed shut by the same unnatural gravity that flattened the rest of the profile. Esther, who was still at an impressionable age, identified with them all. She's not even vaguely as misfortunate as they are. And here we're sort of in the country of that FX 2003 miniseries, Nip Tuck, which is about a pair of Beverly Hills plastic surgeons, which is based on, or inspired by, let's say, obviously, from David Cronenberg's Dead Ringers, upon whom Pynchon had a big influence. And Dead Ringers is about the 2 New York, who are twins, played by Jeremy Irons, and based on a real pair of gynecologists who slept with their patients and did drugs and so forth, and ended up committing a mutual suicide. Nip Tuck then replaces the twin motif with the 2, the doctors, the plastic surgeons, as counterfoils. One is a libertine, and the other is monogamously married, and both wish they had each other's lives. It's actually a pretty good show. It's not that bad. And it's funny also. So Pynchon approaches all this with a great sense of humor, although in the case of David Cronenberg, his stuff is usually not quite as funny. It depends, though. His adaptation of Naked Lunch is quite funny, I think. And then when she is on her first visit, then and she's waiting in the office there, and then Schoenmaker invites her in, and he says, what type of nose do you want? And she wants an upturned nose, an Irish nose, like the kind of nose that you see in fashion magazines, the kind of nose that all the men like. And so she's allowing the media to sort of give her a sort of dysmorphia regarding her body, which she now doesn't like, and she wants to conform her body to the world of the media, since that's what all the celebrities have, and those types of women, their noses are the noses, that the men like. And in a sense, this reminds me of Cronenberg's son Brandon Cronenberg made a film called Antiviral. I think this was back might have been 2005, or maybe a little bit later than that, where in Antiviral, he's got this clinic that specializes in injecting you with the diseases of celebrities, so that if a celebrity gets sick with a certain virus or whatever, they preserve that virus, and then you can go to this clinic and be injected with the same virus that the celebrity had. It's the same kind of thing, allowing the media to distort, warp, and deform our perceptions of ourselves as human beings. This is sort of the country here that Pynchon is playing with. And then so now comes then the nose job, which I want to read a couple pages from here, because there's simply no way to convey how funny it is in just describing it. You can't. It's like telling a joke. It has to be told correctly. You can't describe a joke and have it be funny. So starting on page 108 here, it says, no one had told Esther that anything about the operation would hurt, but these injections hurt. Nothing before in her experience had ever hurt quite so much. All she had free to move for the pain were her hips. Trench is one of the assistants. Schoenmaker has 2 assistants, a woman named Irving, whom he has put little tattoos of freckles on her face, and then this delinquent kid named Trench, who's a bit sadistic. Trench held her head and leered appreciatively as she squirmed, constrained, on the table. Inside the nose again, with another burden of anesthetic, Irving's hypodermic was inserted between the upper and lower cartilage and pushed all the way up to the glabella, the bump between the eyebrows. A series of internal injections to the septum, the wall of bone and cartilage which separates the two halves of the nose, and anesthesia was complete. The sexual metaphor in all this wasn't lost on Trench, who kept chanting, "Stick it in, pull it out, stick it in. Oh, that was good. Pull it out," and tittering softly above Esther's eyes. Irving would sigh each time, exasperated. "That boy," you expected her to say. After a while, Schoenmaker started pinching and twisting Esther's nose. "How does it feel? Hurt?" A whispered no. Schoenmaker twisted harder. "Hurt?" "No." "Okay, cover her eyes." "Maybe she wants to look," Trench said. "You want to look, Esther, see what we're going to do to you?" "I don't know." Her voice was weak, teetering between here and hysteria. "Watch then," said Schoenmaker. "Get an education. First, we'll cut out the hump. Let's see a scalpel." It was a routine operation. Schoenmaker worked quickly, neither he nor his nurse wasting any motion. Caressing sponge strokes made it nearly bloodless. Occasionally a trickle would elude him and get halfway to the towels before he caught it. Schoenmaker first made 2 incisions, one on either side, through the internal lining of the nose, near the septum at the lower border of the side cartilage. He then pushed a pair of long-handled curved and pointed scissors through the nostril, up past the cartilage to the nasal bone. I don't think anyone who sees this video or reads this is going to ever want to get a nose job. It sounds worse than going to the dentist for a root canal. The scissors had been designed to cut both on opening and closing. Quickly, like a barring up a high-tipping head, he separated the bone from the membrane and skin over it. "Undermining, we call this." He repeated the scissors work through the other nostril. "You see, you have 2 nasal bones. They're separated by your septum. At the bottom, they're each attached to a piece of lateral cartilage. I'm undermining you all the way from this attachment to where the nasal bones join the forehead." And there's this sexual metaphor going all through this, that for some reason, all this turns on Esther. She's turned on by the whole thing, and it activates her. Irving passed him a chisel-like instrument. Mackenzie's elevator, this is. With the elevator, he probed around, completing the undermining. "Now, gently, like a lover, I'm going to saw off your hump." Esther watched his eyes as best she could, looking for something human there. Never had she felt so helpless. Later she would say, "It was almost a mystic experience." The mask with the clay nose lay on a small table nearby. Referring to it with quick side glances, Schoenmaker inserted the saw blade through one of the incisions he'd made and pushed it up to the bony part. Then lined it up with the line of the new nose roof and carefully began to saw through the nasal bone on that side. "Bone saws easily," he remarked to Esther. "We're all really quite frail." The blade reached soft septum. Schoenmaker withdrew the blade. "Now comes the tricky part. I got to saw off the other side exactly the same. Otherwise your nose will be lopsided." He doesn't say one comforting thing to her during the whole operation, and his leering assistant Trench looks on sadistically, making jokes. This is the exact opposite of how a patient wants to be treated in the operating room. He inserted the saw in the same way on the other side, studied the mask for what seemed to Esther a quarter of an hour, made several minute adjustments, then finally sawed off the bone there in a straight line. "Your hump is now 2 loose pieces of bone attached only to the septum. We have to cut that through, flush with the other 2 cuts." This he did with an angle-bladed pull knife, cutting down swiftly, completing the phase with some graceful sponge flourishing. "And now the hump floats inside the nose." He pulled back one nostril with a retractor, inserted a pair of forceps, and fished around for the hump. "Take that back," he smiled. "It doesn't want to come just yet." With scissors, he snipped the hump loose from the lateral cartilage which had been holding it. Then with the bone forceps, removed a dark-colored lump of gristle, which he waved triumphantly before Esther. 22 years of social unhappiness, nicht wahr? End of Act 1. We'll put it in formaldehyde. You can keep it for a souvenir if you wish. As he talked, he smoothed the edges of the cuts with a small rasp file. So much for the hump, but where the hump had been was now a flat area. The bridge of the nose had been too wide to begin with, and now had to be narrowed. Again, he undermined the nasal bones, this time around to where they met the cheekbones and beyond. As he removed the scissors, he inserted a right-angled saw in its place. Your nasal bones are anchored firmly, you see, at the side to the cheekbone, at the top to the forehead. We must fracture them so we can move your nose around, just like that lump of clay. He's pointing to a clay nose on a mask. He sawed through the nasal bones on each side, separating them from the cheekbones. He then took a chisel and inserted it through one nostril, pushing it as high as he could until it touched bone. Let me know if you feel anything. He gave the chisel a few light taps with a mallet, stopped, puzzled, and then began to hammer harder. It's a rough, mother, he said, dropping his jocular tone. Tap, tap, tap. Come on, you bastard. The chisel point-edged its way, millimeter by millimeter, between Esther's eyebrows. Scheisse! With a loud snap, her nose was broken free of the forehead. By pushing in from either side with his thumbs, Schoenmaker completed the fracture. See? It's all wobbly now. That's Act 2. Now we shortened das septum, yeah? With a scalpel, he made an incision around the septum between it and its two adjoining lateral cartilages. He then cut down around the front of the septum to the spine, located just inside the nostrils at the back, which should give you a free-floating septum. We used scissors to finish the job. With dissecting scissors, he undermined the septum along its sides and up over the bones as far as the glabella at the top of the nose. And so this is one of the first, really, of Pynchon's over-the-top passages that he does in Gravity's Rainbow. He does a whole bunch of these, like the candy-eating chapter, the orgy chapter. He likes to, part of his sense of humor is just sort of throwing everything at you but the kitchen sink and going way over the top into absolute comic absurdity. So this, you can already see the foreshadowing of that kind of humor that characterizes Gravity's Rainbow that some people don't like. They read Gravity's Rainbow and they expect, or they hear that it's supposed to be this great novel, and they sit down with it and expect it to be this grimly serious, like Christopher Nolan type, like he did Dunkirk, something like that. And it isn't. It's full of vaudeville, jokes, songs. It's absolutely hysterically funny. But that doesn't mean it isn't serious. Nobody is more intelligent of an author than Thomas Pynchon. And so in the final section here, then, Pynchon parodies them now having sex after her nose heals, and then she goes back and he has sex with her, and he portrays it like, he says, we'll do this just like an operation. Here, lie on this bed here. This will be our operating table. And then it's a very funny scene with Trench watching, peering on voyeuristically through curtains at them. And then he finishes by singing this song, and loves songs. He's a guy who packs his fiction with songs. There's always a song, and it gives a kind of a vaudeville flavor to his stuff here. Okay, so that's chapter 4, and then in chapter 5, in which Stencil nearly goes west with an alligator. So we'll see what happens with all of that next.